Whether or not you personally loved or hated Supergirl, objectively speaking, it is the DCU's first real failure of a project. To be clear, Creature Commandos, Superman, and Peacemaker Season 2 were far from perfect, however, the majority of people who watched them enjoyed them, if not really liked them. And that was for both critics and audiences. The one area you could probably argue whether or not these projects have been a success is the overall viewership and box office, which, to be fair, hasn't been amazing, especially for the TV series. But Superman performed really well domestically and ended up being profitable. And after several years of DC movies doing horrible at the box office outside of the Batman, I do think Superman's box office performance was very much a step in the right direction and overall a win for DC Studios. Of course, we can litigate how successful the DCU has been so far, whether that's in a broad scale or just the specific projects, and I'm sure there are a lot of opinions on that, but I do think up to this point, there has been nothing egregiously bad about the DCU, and I do think the DCU at the very minimum has been doing solid and moving the DC brand in a positive direction. As none of the projects so far have been straight out bad and affected the brand in a negative way, you may not like the project so far, but in a broader scale and overall general audience reception, the DCU is doing completely solid. However, now with Supergirl, I think this is the first real point, for lack of better terminology, the DCU has kind of fucked up and have made their first real mistake. Even though Supergirl is not being widely trashed as the worst superhero movie of all time, and like I said in my review, I do think it is far from that, but there are very little positive talking points surrounding this movie outside of the performances of Millie Alcock's Supergirl as well as Jason Momoa's Lobo, which are both being praised even by a lot of the people that did not enjoy the movie overall. But the bottom line is, a lot of people are not enjoying this movie, and I think the B- cinema score, which is basically about the same as getting an F, specifically for comic book movies, B- is about as low as the scale is going to go, and I think that sums it up for this movie. The quality is just not good enough. And to make matters worse, this movie looks like it's going to absolutely bomb at the box office and fall probably well below $250 million worldwide unless there is some sort of miracle. Tracking both domestically and internationally looks awful, and with the large influx of movies on the horizon in a loaded July, Supergirl will most likely end up as one of the worst performing comic book movies of all time with a huge budget of $170 million. I'm sure there are some people who really did love this movie, but I don't even think they'd attempt to try and spin this movie as anything else than a failure. And now with the DCU having its first real failure on its record, I am sure you have been seeing the articles and videos detailing how the DCU is doomed and how James Gunn and Peter Safran might as well start filling out some job applications because they certainly won't be running DC Studios for very long, especially with the upcoming merger of WB and Paramount. And I do think some of the claims we are seeing from people over the weekend are just getting so ridiculous and out of hand. Of course, once Paramount and WB are merged, David Ellison could make a huge change to take control and reboot the universe to better fit what he wants. I cannot speak to the desires of David Ellison and what his grand plan for DC might be. He very well might want to take DC and do something completely different, and that may result in someone else taking over DC Studios. None of us actually know. It has been confirmed by the Hollywood Reporter that Gunn, Safran, and Ellison have met, and that Ellison is open to what DC Studios is currently doing, as he is a big fan, and that so far he's been great to DC Studios. Those are the words of Lars Winter, a very well-known producer that has worked extensively with DC, so I'm going to take his word over a bunch of randoms on the internet. Could things change in the future? Absolutely, but for the sake of this video, I do want to somewhat leave the whole Paramount merger discussion to the side because it's truly an unknown. We could do a whole video speculating on what the merger means, but recklessly speculating about a merger that is yet to go through, it's just not worth our time. I do want to focus though on this idea that's being spread that due to Supergirl's failure, the DCU is all of a sudden now in deep water and we should be worried about its future and whether or not there's any real validity to that claim. And I want to say, I do understand why some people are starting to wonder because DC Studios still falls under the WB umbrella and answers to David Zaslav, who has shown he has no issue axing things or changing course. It's not like DC Studios has free reign to fuck up all they want under WB. There has been immense pressure and will continue to be immense pressure for Gunn and Safran to succeed and successfully launch a new era for DC on the big screen and television. And up to this point, I do think they were positively growing and impacting the brand, but when you fall flat on your face with a movie like this, especially one so early in the process, it's completely reasonable to call into question whether or not DC has the right people for the job. But for the people out there making it seem like there's no way for the DCU to recover from one bad project, and this is just what you can expect from the DCU going forward, kind of piss me off. I get there are people out there who are actively rooting against the DCU and have been ever since its inception, but I'm not really talking about them. There are several people who I legitimately follow and respect that I feel like have just gone way overboard with this discussion, and I understand controversy and radical headlines garner a higher click-through rate, as well as help videos get more views, but I have a hard time actually believing people actually think that one bad movie can just mean everything is over for the DCU. Of course, failure is not acceptable, and if Gunn and Safran keep turning out movies and shows of this quality, they will be fired. I have no doubt about that. But not only do I think the DCU can still thrive going forward, but I also think depending on how Lanterns and Clayface turn out, we may look back at the end of the year and say that the DCU actually did just fine in its second year. Now, I don't think there's any reality where I'll be able to be giving the DCU an A when I end up grading its second year, but if they can knock it out of the park with their next two projects, I do think it could still end up probably being something like a B. Now, in order for the DCU to feel like year 2 is still solid, Lanterns and Clayface need to be anywhere from very good to great. I'm not going to sit here and tell you it's likely because truthfully, none of us actually know, but I am personally quite confident in both projects. Starting with Lanterns, I love the creative team, I like the cast, even though I do fully admit I do not like the idea of an older Hal Jordan, but I do love Kyle Chandler, and I'm confident both he and Aaron Pierre will absolutely deliver great performances in their roles. I've enjoyed the trailers quite a lot so far, and I just flat out trust HBO, and they clearly seem to have some faith in this series as they have placed it in the premiere Sunday night slot, which is something they also did for the Penguin, but didn't do for Peacemaker. I don't need Lanterns to be as good as the Penguin in order to be a success, but I do like where things are trending, and if Lanterns can be great, I do think it'll change the tune about the DCU pretty quickly, especially as Green Lantern is something I do think has a bit more popularity than Supergirl. Clayface is a bit more of a wild card, as it is something quite different than what we typically get from comic book movies, with its dark horror lean and supposedly very small budget of somewhere between 40 and 60 million, but I also think the trailer we got for that movie was quite good, and overall, I was kind of surprised by the seemingly very positive discussion across social media and the overall fan interest. I know earlier in this video I ripped Supergirl for most likely trending towards $200 million worldwide, but if Clayface actually has a $40 million budget and they don't go apeshit with the marketing, $200 million would be a big success, and I do think if the movie is good, it absolutely has a chance considering it has a great October release and the fact that horror has been doing amazing at the box office over the last couple of years. Now certainly, both of these projects can absolutely be awful and even worse than Supergirl. As of right now, we have no idea, so it's not really worth arguing whether or not it's a success or not because we're gonna find out when it releases, but I really don't think that Supergirl's bad performance really has any effect on either of these projects. I highly doubt there are people out there looking forward to Lanterns who now just refuse to see Lanterns or Clayface because Supergirl wasn't that good. Those projects seem to be aiming for different audiences based on their overall genre and tone. You may disagree, but I personally do not think Supergirl has doomed either of those projects. Their performance is going to come down to whether or not they are actually good and whether they are marketed correctly. The one project that I do think is somewhat affected by Supergirl's failures is Man of Tomorrow, considering Supergirl will be featured in the movie, and I do think Supergirl not being great certainly doesn't help generate buzz or anticipation for Man of Tomorrow, and to some extent I do think that puts a bit more pressure on Man of Tomorrow to not only just be a good movie but also to perform at the box office. But if we're being honest, hasn't there always been immense pressure on Man of Tomorrow? Of course, James Gunn and Peter Safran were hoping for much better out of Supergirl, both in its overall reception as well as its box office, but even if Supergirl was great and made say $500 million, which I do think would probably be about the 90th percentile outcome, Man of Tomorrow was always going to be the true test for whether or not the DCU really had a chance. If Man of Tomorrow bombs, then I really do think conversations can be had about whether or not the DCU needs to be abolished. Man of Tomorrow is basically a Justice League level movie, and I'm sure it's going to have a humongous budget. And because of that, it simply needs to do well, as it is building off the DCU's best achievement so far, that being Superman. It's a movie centered around its main character in Superman, and with the huge cast of characters including the likes of Supergirl, Green Lantern, the Justice Gang, as well as several other rumored huge characters, it needs to probably cross at least $800 million, and even that may be a little low. For a real massive win, and honestly a declaration that the DCU has arrived and is here to stay for the foreseeable future, it probably needs $1 billion, and I think that was always the case. Like I said earlier, I don't want to make it all about Paramount, but I do think that if Man of Tomorrow comes out and makes $1 billion, that is one way for Gunn and Safran to kind of take the decision out of Ellison's hands. Unless the movie makes $1 billion and is just awful, which I could be wrong, but I do think that's virtually impossible in today's market. Now, I do not think it needs to make $1 billion to be a success, and there's certainly a world where Man of Tomorrow is only a modest step up from Superman financially, and Paramount still gives Gunn and Safran the green light to continue, but I do think it's completely fair for expectations to be sky high for Man of Tomorrow, but I really don't think Supergirl has affected those in any way. Would a great Supergirl movie have helped build some of the hype and momentum? Absolutely, but if Man of Tomorrow succeeds and makes, say, $850 million and it universally is loved, it's not like Ellison is going to ask Gunn and Safran to come into his office and say, hey guys, you killed it with Man of Tomorrow, but because you kind of fucked up Supergirl, I'm going to have to let you go. The only way I see a conversation even remotely like that happening is if Lanterns and Clayface are both awful, then yeah, I would say the track record would be pretty bad up to that point, and a firing could definitely be a defensible decision, but we have no idea how those projects are going to do, and we can cross that bridge when we get there. And similar to Lanterns and Clayface, I don't think there were people that went into Supergirl, were disappointed, and have now said, yeah, I'm not gonna go see Man of Tomorrow next year. I really don't think it has that much effect, just like I don't really think a really good Supergirl movie would have ultimately moved the needle that much. Yes, it may have helped build some anticipation towards Man of Tomorrow, but Man of Tomorrow's success is going to come down to whether or not it is a good movie on its own. Now, even though in this video I've sat here and made it very clear that I think the DCU can still have a very bright future, I do think there is plenty of fair criticism to be had for Gunn and Safran, and I'm not trying to say we just need to let them off easy. There are some lessons I'm hoping they learn from this failure. First off, it goes without saying, but make better projects in terms of its overall quality. Secondly, I do think the people who hated on the overall first slate and the lack of real A-list characters like Batman, Wonder Woman, and The Flash right out the gate may have kind of been right to at least some extent. I definitely think there is room for lesser known characters to get projects early on in the DCU, and I do understand maybe wanting to wait when rebooting characters that have gotten movies relatively recently. The most prime examples of that being Aquaman and The Flash, but if you're gonna go that direction and perhaps focus a bit more on a more obscure character, especially in the eyes of the general audience, I think it is far more strategically wise to go low budget, similar to what you did with Clayface, while you attempt to rebuild the brand of DC, which by the end of 2023 was in the gutter outside of Batman due to a decade of films that for the most part fans did not like. DC currently does not have the benefit of the doubt like the MCU did post Avengers, where basically Feige could have greenlit a movie about almost any character in Marvel's entire catalog and probably at worst made $500 million. Hell, the MCU today doesn't even have that, as we saw last year with something like Thunderbolts, a movie that I thought was just awesome and had characters who have been in the MCU for years but couldn't even crack $400 million. It is a different world of movies which we live in, especially with things like streaming, more pirating, and social media in general. Outside of a few characters, you need to build fan buy-in and interest over a string of consistently good projects. Even if Supergirl was amazing, there was a very high chance that it probably would have ended up like Thunderbolts and underperformed at the box office, which is a damn shame, but just look at the last few years of comic book movies. Interest is down due to both Marvel and DC being very inconsistent post-pandemic. And outside of the A-list characters like Spider-Man, Batman, or huge event movies, comic book movies no longer get to just roll out of bed and make $500 million. Now, some may say that this is irreversible and we will never reach the heights of the prime MCU, and even though I do agree with that last part, as I do think it's very unlikely we see anything like the prime MCU ever again, where it felt like the floor for a movie was damn near $600 million worldwide, but I do absolutely believe that both Marvel and DC can get to a point where a movie like Thunderbolts or a really great potential Supergirl movie can make $500 million or more, but it's gonna take time to build the hype and anticipation again, and it most likely will require both to be hitting at something like an 80% clip over the next several years. In the meantime though, before you can guarantee that movies around characters like Supergirl, which is not an A-list character in DC's catalog in terms of popularity, have natural intrigue just by being associated with the brand of the DCU, it'd probably be smart to focus on A-list characters like the Trinity or other Justice League members just to get people in theaters, and I mean, even with characters like that, it's gonna take time. Just look at Superman or the beginning of the MCU. Movies like Captain America the First Avenger, Incredible Hulk, and Thor 1 were not some mega successes, but for the most part people liked them, and after the Avengers, the movies took off like crazy. That is what the DCU needs to do. Set up your big players like the Justice League in individual shows or movies, hopefully knock it out of the park with something like the Justice League, and then start really expanding into the different corners of the universe you want to explore, which I do still think have immense potential to succeed. I certainly think it's okay to take some random swings in the early days of the DCU, but if you're going to do that on some lesser known characters, I do think it's quite smart to be conscious of budget. That's why I'm so interested in something like Clayface. With a budget of $40 million, you give yourself yourself such a better opportunity to succeed. Now, I don't think that $40 million is a feasible budget for a lot of DC characters, but you're telling me you can't do a Green Arrow movie for something like $100 million or less? I kind of find that hard to believe, and that's just one example of something that I think DC Studios could do that would probably be pretty smart strategically. And we know there's going to be some other obscure ideas and specifically shows that aren't going to be featuring A-list stars, but for the immediate future, especially with the movies, maybe we focus a bit more on the more popular characters. Maybe we get to work on something like The Brave and the Bold ASAP and try to release that movie in 2028 so we can have the DCU version of Batman. Maybe we fast track Wonder Woman, and my personal favorite is James Gunn. Get on the damn phone and call Lord and Miller immediately, telling them you have a blank check with their name on it so they can develop the Flash movie they have mentioned they are still hoping to make someday. I'm sure some of you will think I'm just some DCU shill putting my head in the ground to ignore the quote-unquote reality of the situation, and there's no doubt I desperately want the DCU to succeed because I'm a fan of DC and I've always wanted DC to have something remotely as successful as the MCU in my lifetime, but I have never claimed that the DCU is perfect and without criticism. You can watch my year one review for the DCU where I had plenty of complaints alongside my compliments. There are plenty of reasons to be worried about the future of the DCU because it hasn't been perfect, and if Supergirl is an omen for what's to come over the next year, it's very likely we will once again be talking about a rebooted DCU, which would drive me absolutely insane, but I definitely acknowledge it's a real possibility. But I am far from giving up hope on the DCU. There is still potential there, and I'm still super excited for the next 3 projects, but regardless of whether or not you are praying for the DCU to fail or hoping James Gunn and Peter Safran are running the DCU still a decade from now, can we please all just agree to take a deep breath, acknowledge that we have no clue how the DCU is going to turn out, and at the very minimum, just let the projects that are currently in development release before jumping to any huge conclusions about the DCU's future. However, even though I urge you all to not jump to any massive conclusions or make any huge sweeping radical claims over the next couple of weeks, I would love to hear what your thoughts are about the DCU so far. Have you enjoyed the DCU? Have you hated it? Are you worried about its future? Let me know in the comments. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all in another video.